Well, hello and welcome to day, I guess, 3 of the American Heart Association's virtual meetings. I know I have enjoyed actually watching the last few days of really good science being presented to these meetings. And thank you all for tuning in today to this session. This session, SFRN for Health Tech Roundtable Discussion. I will welcome all of you to send in your messages in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. This is designed to be an interactive session, one of considerable interest to many of us who are on this panel, but also around the world. Certainly, as we've come into this year of COVID, or a year or 2 years almost now, we have found the importance of innovating what we do every day. It would have been unbelievable years past if we would have thought about in the setting of a pandemic that within weeks or if not days, institutions went from fully in-person visits to fully virtual, developing all sorts of other novel ways of touching, reaching out to our patients, keeping in contact, diagnosing and ultimately treating our individuals. So it's very appropriate that the Heart Association, even before this began, had a Center for Health Technology Innovation, for which we looked at what was the cutting edge of new technologies out there and how could we integrate them back into our clinical practice, find their value, test, evaluate, ultimately transform both the technologies, but also how we practice medicine in a better fashion. This has been going on for several years under the wonderful leadership of Patrick Waite, who I'll take the opportunity first to introduce and say hello. Patrick?
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate that introduction. And yeah, I'll just echo and build a little bit on what you're saying there. And the American Heart Association's dedication to an interest in the digital health tech, and telehealth space writ large is ongoing, it's dynamic, and it's something that has built on a tremendous amount of research and thinking that we've been doing over many years in the space ourselves, trying to figure out how digital health in all of its various forms can align, and we can align to it to dramatically move healthcare forward, both for providers, for patients and their families, and for that intersection where they're really meeting together with the hope of improving care in a scalable way using a range of apps and remote patient monitoring solutions and all the systems and platforms that accompany them. And through the Center for Health Tech and Innovation, we've been focused primarily on aligning with a range of companies in the space and researchers and experts like yourselves to do exactly that. And meaningfully, the Strategically Focused Research Network for Health Tech, which we're here to talk about today, is one of the key strategies that the American Heart Association is pursuing in order to stimulate and advance outcomes research in this great space. So happy to be here, happy to welcome these great researchers and experts and talk more about this effort in digital health.
And maybe I'll take just 1 second before introducing our panelists to discuss just a little bit about the network itself, because I think the network actually has several novel features in it. Like many, the goal was to collaborate across individual centers devoted to a topic, this time looking at digital health. But in addition to that, there was an effort and emphasis on training of young investigators, and each program certainly has adopted that strategy of incorporating the next generation, in this case, probably much better than our generation at incorporating technology into their practice. So that was an important feature that is certainly been taken up by all the centers. But a third factor that I think is really phenomenal is the ability to not only collaborate and learn from one another on what progress was being made, but to actively actually getting engaged with each other during this project. More than others, there's been a sharing of technology and ideas across programs, but they've all come together under a single project, which hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss, where they're all working together on a single project that was provided with additional funding to allow that research to go forward. And then the final aspect that's a little bit different here is, unlike the other SFRMs where the final product is purely knowledge, This also had the ideas of if we developed something along the way that really had impact, could we scale it? And that scaling could come in a variety of different fashions, from not only publications of the journal articles, sharing of the technologies as they come out there, or even commercialization potentially at some point downstream. So I think we have really cut some new grounds with this SFRN. I applaud the Heart Association for its, in part, bravery to go into brave new worlds and to move into these, as well as I'd also like to take an opportunity as one who was on the original selection process. We did a darn good job. Every one of the centers that we have chosen have really done outstanding work, and we'll be give you a little taste of that today. So with those as sort of preamble to this meeting, I give a little bit of a shout out to first Dr. Paul Wang. Dr. Wang is a distinguished professor of medicine and bioengineering at Stanford. He is also the director of the Stanford Cardiac Arrhythmia Service and is here to talk about Stanford's program. In addition, he will also talk about some of the common elements as they're related to challenges in implementation and sustainability. Paul?
Great. Thanks to Eric and Patrick and all of the AHA for having this session, and my colleagues. Yeah, so I'm delighted to talk on behalf of the Stanford SFRN, which is being led by Mintu Tarakia. He's the center director. I'm the project director. Our project is centered around a digital hypertension management solution. And so just to talk about some of those challenges that we face, both in terms of moving the project to product, and then also the particular training aspects as well. But first, the issue about product. I think what we started by coming up with an idea that there are certainly many issues in terms of the management and limitations in management of hypertension. About 50% of patients with hypertension are felt to be undermanaged in terms of not reaching goal. There's certainly patient-facing aspects of that, compliance, adherence to medication, adverse effects, et cetera. But we also identified the influence of what we call clinician inertia, the time it takes, the demands of, particularly in an under-resourced setting, where there isn't the ability to follow up closely with patients, to have the touch points that really has been shown by numerous studies that requires typically in the non-digital space, human interaction, a visit in the clinic with a nurse, frequent phone calls to check on their blood pressure. And so we asked the question, can we come up with a product that will allow us to do this digitally, but not to increase the workload that the clinician has to face. And so that was our goal. And that's really where we are. We've developed a prototype 1.0. We're in the process of creating our 2.0 product. And then the heels of that will be a clinical trial, a randomized trial to show that in fact we're successful in implementing that. And so that's really one of the biggest aspects. And then really we face the issue of integration with EHR. Will clinicians use it? Can we actually avoid the problem of making their lives more complicated? As you know, we've added to different steps in medical care, adding the EHR, et cetera. Can we actually simplify it? And so that's the goal we've given ourselves, is a way to do that, and be happy to answer any questions regarding it. Thanks.
Sorry, thanks a lot, Paul, for that overview. Let's just try to get through each of the three panelists to begin with, and then we'll open it up for general conversation. So our next panelist is Dr. Seth Martin, and Seth is an associate professor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and is also the director of advanced lipid disorders program of the Ciccone Center. Seth, will you give us a quick overview of your center?
Absolutely, Eric. Thank you so much. And let me just start by saying that we've learned a ton from Paul and from Rhoda as we've gone along. And it's just been a pleasure of our center to be part of this network. And we're really grateful to you, Eric, for your leadership on the oversight committee, as well as for helping create this whole network with Patrick and the team. So just wanted to start with a thank you. So our center is now we have a logo and we have the name of our center. So the name of our center is MTech, Mobile Technologies to Achieve Equity in Cardiovascular Health. That name of our center took actually a lot of thought, and in fact was informed by our colleagues in our Center for Health Equity. Originally, if you look at the AHA program, even it has the terminology reducing disparities, but at the direction of our colleagues, we really changed the language from disparities to achieving equity. And so all the work of our center is done through an equity first lens, and we're guided through by Yvonne Commodore Mensa, Lisa Cooper, Nancy Malello, and their team really thinking through that, because it's about ultimately delivering solutions at scale, but at scale so that they're accessible to everyone, and so that everyone has the chance to really have a level playing field and achieve their best possible health and outcomes and live a full life. So very much aligned with the mission of the AHA. So to get very concrete about what we're working on, we actually had two kind of teams coming into this within our university that were interested for going for this award. And in the spirit of collaboration, we came together and tried to integrate our teams as much as possible. So David Newman Toker has led a group out of neurology that's really made incredible progress with improving stroke diagnosis by analyzing eye movements. And so originally they built technology that uses goggles, and they're now taking that technology from the goggles to the smartphone, specifically the iPhone. So that ultimately would reduce the cost and increase the scalability of their technology to improve stroke diagnosis. And then the second aspect of our center's initial project to launch is on the management side of things. So we have nice kind of complementary nature from diagnosis to management. And so on the management side of things, we're building out our CORI platform. That's CORRIE, CORI, which is something we've been working on for 6+ years at Hopkins. This initially started with Francoise Marvel, who was an intern at the time, and now went through our fellowship and just recently joined our Hopkins cardiology faculty. So speaking of the future generation of health tech leaders, this CORI project has really been a springboard for that. Along the way, Francoise has really inspired many trainees to join the project and really building out that workforce. So originally, CORI was designed to provide patient education, management, and we delivered this at the time of a heart attack in the hospital. So a lot of health tech's been outpatient. Here we were inpatient, really connecting with the patient at that moment that matters to educate them, but also provide the tools to be successful in following the guidelines. And so we've had initial success. I might have time to talk a bit more about that later. And we're building on the initial success of the CORI program in heart attack now to scale it up into a virtual cardiac rehab setting, which is a setting that I think many people know is highly underutilized, a highly evidence-based program, but highly underutilized. So we're working to build out, based on our CORI platform, this virtual cardiac rehab solution. So anyway, I think I've been long-winded enough, so I'm going to cut myself off there, turn it back to you, Eric, but I'm looking forward to sharing more details about the work of our center. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Seth. And it was a great overview, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you in just a bit. Our third panelist, and certainly not last but or least, is Dr. Rhoda Owl. She is a professor in the Department of Anatomy and Neurology and Neurology and Epidemiology at Boston University School of Medicine and Public Health, and the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. Rhoda, would you like to give us a little overview?
Sure. So, thank you again for including me in this panel, and actually also just including me with this SFRN group. For us, my focus has always been on the brain, but as a longtime investigator at the Framingham Heart Study, I've obviously had to look at sort of the connection between the heart and the brain, but I've always done it what I would say from a more, obviously community-based, sort of research-based, so much more theoretically based. And so what's really nice about sort of being part of this team is that I really get to think about how to practically bring that heart to brain connection in a much more pragmatic way and down really to the level of the actual, person. From my end, I've been thinking a lot about precision brain health as an alternative to precision AD treatment, for instance. A large area of my work has always been around Alzheimer's disease. And it's really about thinking about the connections to the brain that are much more life course based rather than something that happens at the end of life or toward the end of the older decades of life, something that really starts to happen much earlier on. And I think that that's a really key area in which this heart-brain connection is really critical. So on our end, we're interested in deploying a much more robust digital platform. And the reason is because I think it was important that we embrace the complexity of the brain. I think that in our attempts to sort of reduce and isolate different components related to brain activities, I think that's probably one of the reasons why we're not finding lots of useful solutions. So in our center, we're really being very expansive in our use of different digital technologies, because it's the kind of the belief that there's not going to be one application or one device or one solution that's really going to help us understand the brain in all its complexity. And so we're deploying, both in clinic, remotes, wearables, smartphone applications, et cetera. But importantly, the other thing that we're trying to do in moving forward with our platform, and this is really work being led by my colleague, Hung-Hwang Lin, is understanding that we have to build digital solutions that will reach everybody. So I think Seth talked a lot about their commitment to inclusivity, and we have that same idea within our center, and then that actually runs through all our centers, right? That we need to make sure that when we're thinking about digital, we're thinking about it as a solution that embraces all, not just some. And so digital obviously allows us to expand our reach much broader than we ever have been able to do when we've been limited to sort of our in-clinic and sometimes very expensive, I think, methods of going forward. And then because of the complexity of the data that we're bringing, which is really multi-sensor digital data streams, that also means that we have to have a different analytic approach. And so to that end, my colleague Vijaya Kolachalama is leading our efforts to really think about where data science and AI come in to help us build towards solutions that can handle, not just handle, actually really capitalize on the multidimensionality of these different digital data streams. And one of the visions that we have is that we're really going to be able to really identify and define digital biomarkers, not as a single, cut point, single signal, single pattern, but really a dynamic fluid of different kinds of behaviors that are being measured in different ways that really reflect the clinical heterogeneity that you see in the real world. So I'm just going to stop there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. So with these three brief peeks, you've gotten an idea of some of the diversity of both topic areas as well as even research domains and research interest expressed by our group. Perhaps I'll first call on Patrick to share a little of the other members of this austere group, that he can give a quick overview of the other centers that were selected as part of the SFRN.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And as you say, we're only going to add riches to the group. There's 5 centers in this network, all working, as you noted, independently and their own projects, but then coming together in a very exciting way to work on a joint project and bringing their skills and expertise to that effort as well. The other nodes of the network, if you will, are at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. That group led by Dr. Andrea Beaton, and they're really looking at rheumatic heart disease issue that's affects tens of millions of children globally, and very often in lower income and diverse socioeconomic issues related to that disease. And so very much aligned with AHA goals, and very much taking a digital and health tech approach. That team is really doing exciting work. The other is the University of Michigan, and that group is led by Dr. Brahmaji Nalathamu. I think I've got that right. Apologize if I didn't get it quite right. And that group is really working on a cluster of wearable devices and adaptive learning and nudging and education for patients with hypertension. And in that scenario, working and looking mostly at lifestyle and medication issues, and trying to understand how essentially a care plan can be adapted around the patient's needs as monitored on an ongoing basis with biometric monitoring on a core and base platform. So a nice mix of self-actualization with patients and understanding what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but pooling and analyzing that data for, again, education and proactive nudging over time. So really nice complementary efforts by the other nodes of the network. And ultimately, again, they'll be bringing those skill sets and the teams around them to the joint project as well.
Well, thanks, Patrick. Maybe I'll begin perhaps back with Paul, just sort of direct a question, but anybody of the panelists are allowed to weigh in. You know, I suspect when you began your career, you didn't anticipate that at some point downstream, you'd be working with Mintu on development and applications of sort of digital technologies in your practice. Maybe you want to just discuss briefly, how did that transition happen?
Great. So yeah, I mean, everything's a story. So this one actually came out of the Stanford By-Design program. So the Stanford By-Design program is a program to train innovators and at various levels, typically the postdoctoral level. People who have either finished training, et cetera, might even be in business and or an engineer in practice. But we created a new program, which is called the Stanford By-Design Faculty Fellowship. So I helped co-create that, but I decided I better take it. So I said, okay, well, let's look at some of the problems. And as you know, I'm an arrhythmia specialist. And I said, well, gee, I do that day in and day out. That would, I wanted to kind of look afresh at the cardiovascular space. And clearly, one of the things that jumped out was hypertension. It's such an important cardiovascular risk factor, and management is really important. And as you know, in underserved populations, it is particularly a crisis. So armed with that information and really the desire to come up with a solution, really towards the underserved and underserved settings, that's really what grabbed me in terms of doing that. And then Mintu runs the Center for Digital Health at Stanford. So he's a colleague. And so I naturally went to him and said, what can we do together? And so a little bit of a roundabout story, but I'm sure many people have those. But that's how we came about it in applying for the SFRN together.
That's a great answer. Maybe I'll turn to Seth briefly. Paul brought up the important issue of using technology to address a problem of disparities or as you would say, promoting equity. It's remarkable that we think and we even talk about that concept. When we originally developed digital technologies, we worried about a digital divide where some people in the have-not categories of the world would be left behind, and we would just help once again the well and wealthy of the world. What are your thoughts? How have your centers thought about both the issue as potential ways over it as we try to promote equity in these solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's a critical question. I mean, and my thinking has rapidly evolved over the last couple of years working with colleagues in the Center for Health Equity. when we first started building our solution, we were only on the iPhone and Apple Watch, and that worried us that we would drive a digital divide. And even early on, as we started planning our initial trial, the MyCore trial, we're just worried about being able to recruit enough people if we're only on that platform, what we could do. And it's about access to technology, but then ultimately it's also about the digital literacy. Can you even use it if you have access to it? So I remember a time Francoise and I were in the Harbor East area of Baltimore in the street. We had just had a meeting and we were kind of just starting to brainstorm what we would do around this. So we did create a loaner program for devices. We call it our iShare program. So by making, using our research dollars to buy iPhones, our colleagues at Apple were generous enough to donate watches to our study. We were able to make them then accessible to everybody. And to give you a very clear example of what that kind of meant for people, we have a patient by the name of Tammy who joined our study. We've published her story. She's very willing to share her story. She gives her patient perspective in a case report that we published at BMJ Case Report. She would not have been able to participate in our trial had we not had this loaner program available. And so she was someone who had, didn't have access to a lot of the latest technology. She had like one of the clamshell phones. So we gave her a phone with Corey loaded on it just after she had had a heart attack. And actually Francoise delivered it to her. And Francoise was busy and went off to go do something and came back. And Tammy had really onboarded herself onto the platform. She started binge watching the videos that night and then was asking questions of the medical team on rounds the next day. She started tracking her steps on the Apple Watch around the nursing station at the hospital. And she really, really connected with the technology. But for her, it wasn't so much about the technology. It was really about getting a program that cared about her. But the technology was the medium to get to that. So there's many more people like Tammy out there, and we need to reach them and meet them where they are. For Tammy, she was impressively able to use the technology, but a lot of people are going to require more coaching. And that's where some of the work that our colleagues like Yvonne Commodore-Mensah are starting to do with linking technology with community health workers to support that aspect in the community, to really provide that support, is going to be important towards this mission of health equity. So we figured it out in this context of the research study, but as we think of long-term about scalable models, as Patrick was saying, part of the question is who's going to pay for this stuff to make sure that it's accessible to everyone we're serving. And some people don't even have regular broadband internet. And when I mentioned that we gave the phone, we also loaded like a cellular chip in there for people so they had cellular access anywhere they go. And we remarkably didn't have a lot of problems with that. We had one patient who traveled internationally during the trial and racked up a big bill, on their cellular. But for the most part, we didn't have big issues there. But those are the types of challenges that when we really on the boots on the ground start to figure out how we truly do this with an equity first lens.
Yeah, no, those are great answers. And I do think it points out that at least the potential to make things better if we can just overcome these very operational issues of sort of getting the technology in their hands. I think about many of my patients when they're struggling to hold down a pretty busy job, taking off days to come in and see me in clinic to get further help or modifications of their disease state is a very difficult task. And so sometimes very interestingly and gratifyingly, paradoxically, we can see that these technologies actually have more impact on people's lives who are struggling to get that work done relative to the executive who can take a day off pretty easily and come in and see things. Maybe Patrick, you'd want to comment just a little. There are a series of other projects that involve the Heart Association is testing out. SFRN is one of these great ones. But if we look at what we're thinking about and doing in other areas of the Heart Association, I'm thinking more specifically in the areas of hypertension that Paul mentioned that they're working on, and a little bit of where we're going with Doctors with Heart. That might be also a nice segue.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Happy to share. The challenges in these areas like hypertension are enormous, domestically and globally, and the disparities issue is really challenging here. And one of the things that we've been doing over many years with your leadership and many of your colleagues is looking at the issue of hypertension and hypertension management, just as several of the centers are here in the network, trying to figure out ways to bring people to better control through remote means and technologies, and honing a series of, if you will, care plans and models to make that happen using remote patient monitoring and scalable AI elements, as well as self-education and devices and kiosks and what have you. And that work really modeled itself into what we now think of as a national hypertension initiative. And we received funds last year from Office of Minority Health to do that with about 400 community clinics, and essentially helping clinicians better understand how to take accurate readings for blood pressure, and also to provide community support for those clinics and their patients, and ultimately doing a series of pilots at those clinics that look at this issue of remote monitoring. Similarly, and in a kind of a complementary way, as you noted, we've launched a program we call Doctors with Heart, which is really oriented around providing expert cardiovascular consults to these same community health centers and clinics around the country, of which there are many thousands, and really thinking about how our membership, our professional membership, of which we have tens of thousands of great clinicians and researchers at the American Heart Association, can really provide mentorship, clinical support, advice, and guidance directly to these practicing clinicians and nurses at these clinics, who are often volunteers themselves and overworked and understaffed, and, as we all seem to be, through telehealth platforms. So this is a very exciting set of initiatives, and certainly hypertension is first and foremost on our minds with regard to the National Hypertension Initiative, and certainly is as well for Doctors with Heart, although Doctors with Heart is intended to cover a wide range of health topics and arrhythmias and heart failure and various aspects of care where there's a gap in knowledge or an opportunity for the AHA to weigh in a very novel way, again, using, in that instance, telehealth platforms. So it's an exciting time, and these are just, as you say, are different ways that we're addressing the challenge in addition to this great work that the SFRN is doing.
Rhoda, thanks, Patrick, by the way. Rhoda, you'd mentioned, or we mentioned before, this idea of a digital divide as it relates to perhaps race or socioeconomic status in this country. You're dealing with a slightly different phenomena that I think about often as being from a certain generation. Older individuals often struggle with technology, yet a lot of what you're starting to study with regard to the heart brain involves exactly that, the interactions of older individuals, their cognitive functioning, and technology. Talk about what you found when you started to get into this work. I find it remarkably fascinating and a great addition into our program, but I think you create this really interesting intersection of a different digital divide.
Sure. So it is the case that most people think that if you're working with an older population, that they're going to have difficulty with technology. And it is true that the elderly population as a whole, if you look, for instance, at what the AARP has done in surveying elderly people and their use of technology, it certainly lags, but it's still in the 80+ percentile. And so I like to point out that, at the end of the day, a smartphone, which is really a computer in your hand, it is the most penetrating technology in the world, actually. And so I think that my experience has been that if you have the right value proposition, even older participants who may not seem like they embrace things that are new will embrace things that are new. You just have to make it really relevant to them. So I always like to remind myself that they've been able to manage much of their life without these digital technologies. So what do I have to do in order to take this technology and make it meaningful for them? And I think if you do that, and given our focus on brain health, as opposed to just neurodegenerative disorders, you're capturing a much larger population, at least in the upper age ranges. And the other thing that I would remind us is that we keep increasing that age range. So what we used to think as elderly, even a decade or so ago, I now think as kind of more younger population, because the fastest growing population, elderly population, is actually our centenarians. And so there's a pretty broad range now in terms of what might be defined as elderly. But I think the other thing is, and I try to be a little bit realistic about, to the extent that anybody actually likes to adopt anything that's new to them. It's also this idea that we have to think about how we can use, for instance, the smartphone much more effectively. So the other thing is, not only is it a computer, but it's also actually multi-sensor. So there are at least 27 different sensors in every single smartphone. And if we can sort of leverage all of that, I talked earlier about the need that it needs to be multi-sensor input. If we can sort of leverage that and collect using these sensors on a more passive basis, rather than what we call active engagement, where you have to do something, you have to download, et cetera. If we can actually develop a way in which we now collect the data much more passively, much more continuously, then I think we have a solution that will actually address some of the what I would say is more perceived limitations, because I got to tell you, we're deploying a pretty extensive digital platform right now with our older participants. And it's been even surprising to me how readily they've been able to adapt to it. But I think it's because they're motivated, quite frankly. And if you're motivated, turns out, sure, you can learn to do it, because at the end of the day, we don't develop them to try to, make sure you have to have a degree in IT in order to use them. So I think it's very encouraging in terms of how we're going. And I think that this is literally the only way in which we're going to get broad reach, because we're not doing it now anyway. So I like to point that out, is at least in my world, in the AD world, we are collecting 90% of our data on 10% of the population. And that's just not getting us to where we need to go.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great answer. I don't know if any of you want to comment on your experiences of trying to conduct and develop a technology and then test it during an active pandemic in this country. But it might be interesting to hear. We've heard several of the speakers through some of the late-breaking clinical trials talk about just the standstill that the COVID crisis came to their research. I was curious about how it might have impacted your work. Paul, looks like you got your hand up.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So actually, I'll pivot to another SFRN. We're part of the atrial fibrillation SFRN, and we developed a digital technology. It's a web-based app that is designed to take patients considering anticoagulation. And so we developed that with some colleagues in industry, design thinkers, people who were very thoughtful about the construction of the app, and then an additional firm developed the app itself. And so we enrolled our first patient December before the pandemic, and we're about to roll it out to the other centers, and we realized, we're not seeing anybody in person. We've got to pivot pretty quickly to a virtual trial. So we backed up, went through our IRBs and redid our manual operations for our trial, and got it to our several sites that were active and were about to be activated, and kind of started over. And so, really to our, I would say the first several months, we were so far behind that if you took the line and drew the dotted line, we would probably enroll a quarter of the entire population we were going to enroll. We were planning to enroll about 1,000 patients. If you took that dotted line of enrollment, it would take us to like 250. So, but goodness, I mean, things kind of opened up. Some of our centers went partially in person and some virtual. Others kept it largely as virtual, and we've continued a hybrid model since then. And so, in doing so, we more than caught up. So the slope of enrollment was faster than that we initially projected, and so we're going to be on target now, or very close to it. So it can be done. We were very fortunate, had some really remarkably resilient research coordinators at the sites, and we're able to manage to do that in a pandemic, as you mentioned.
Eric, I can add a little bit if you'd like. I mean, first of all, it's been impressive watching what Paul and Mintu and the Stanford team have done to pivot. We had to pivot a little bit. So the initial work in our MTech center was focused on human-centered design. And so that's something where traditionally it's been done in a large conference room with like a whiteboard, and you're taking notes using, the whiteboard, putting up Post-it notes as we invite our patients and their family into the co-ideation, co-creation process. So we had to shift all that to virtual. So it was the first time that our team, that our Nancy Malello and the Center for Health Equity, who've collaborated with our SFRN fellow Nino Isakadze, they shifted all that to a virtual setting. They've experimented with a few different technologies. So in addition to just bringing everyone together on Zoom, they've used several different technologies. Now, the latest they're using is the Google, I think it's called Jamboard. I may be messing that up, but I think that's what they're using to kind of to help everyone creatively collaborate in real time and map out the patient journeys and understand their needs, but then also to ideate around solutions. So, the main experience we've had is shifting all of that to the virtual setting, and of course doing remote consent as well. We've had for remote consent, we've used to some extent ResearchKit. Then more recently, our university signed some agreements with DocuSign. So that's an option now to do DocuSign for remote consent. Taking a step back, I think our network, our health technology network, we're kind of beautifully designed for the world of virtual trials. And to some extent, the pandemic, it forced us to pivot a little bit, but it didn't necessarily bring our work to a standstill. I think each of the centers have been able to persist. Yeah, and we launched like right there. It was April of 2020 that our network launched. So it was right there at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, a little bit. Rhoda, sure.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, feel free.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, I think that what it's allowed us to, well, first of all, because there's wariness about older people being able to use technology, that started to strip down that skepticism because of the need. There were no other options. So I think that at least in my world, it really opened up I've been talking about technology for quite a bit, and I think I got a more receptive ear, I think, from my colleagues now that we were in this situation where all of us had to find another way to do it the way we've traditionally done. I think that the other thing that it's done is it also has led us to come up with what I call pandemic-proof solutions, because we don't know where things are headed. And so by having sort of these remote options, these technological options, whether it's, through the video conferencing or through the smartphone or et cetera, I think what happens is that it's taken away a lot more of the uncertainty that this pandemic actually continues to pull in, because we still don't know. And I can tell you, even for our elderly participants, we're seeing many more than we can remotely than we are getting into clinic, because they're still wary about coming into in-person, because they are the more vulnerable population when it comes to this pandemic. So I think it's been an interesting pivot, not just within our centers, but I think it's about the mindset in general.
That's great. I do want to give one. I mentioned early on the fact that the SFRNs both individually had their own projects that they were conducting, but they also were charged with a really interesting experiment on the part of the Heart Association that said, we have a bucket of extra money that is available, but it is up to you guys to think about both what the topic will be and what the design is. Everything has to be set up during the first year of the project, and then we'll review and modify and ultimately launch this project. But that was an interesting experiment, and maybe you both all could comment a little bit. One of you can give sort of an overview of what the project is, and then the others might comment on sort of the process of how do you come together and create science on the fly. Maybe Seth, do you want to try the project, and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, so the project is called .HF, which stands for, Rhoda, Paul, help me out here, digitally optimized therapy for heart failure, something like that. Digital, there's something digital in there, .HF. So I guess we'll get to the process of sort of how we got to that, but clearly we did not pick an easy problem. We picked heart failure, and there's already been technology approaches to heart failure before. So at a high level, this is a path that folks have gone down, but we're trying to bring the strengths of all our centers to do this in the best, in a new way, in a better way. So the way that we're going about this is we're starting with understanding the technology landscape, all the tools that are out there. In our initial phase here, we want to, if things that are built, that are ready to go, that are effective in this space, we want to start with them. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We are also using human-centered design to start, where we're doing this virtually across centers. So we're going to be recruiting patients and doing the virtual sessions like we've done at Hopkins to really understand the needs of our end users, because we start with the needs and then we work backwards. And if we need to tweak the technologies in ways that to meet those needs, we need to do that. Then there's going to be some pilot testing, and then there's going to be some scaling this up across the centers to test. And our initial focus in terms of outcomes, there's a lot of patient outcomes we're interested in. The initial outcome of focus is medication optimization according to the guidelines. So getting people on the beta blockers, as well as the newer agents like ARNIs and SGLT2 inhibitors, and obviously MRAs as well. So the goal is to get people on we know that there's this huge gap. Many people like Greg Fonarow have shown the huge gap in implementation of the 4 pillars of heart failure therapy. So that's our ultimate goal. How exactly we're going to get there is still somewhat to be determined, because it's going to be guided by the patient process here, the human-centered design process early on, as well as understanding the full landscape of what folks have done. I guess to add sort of another layer to this is obviously connecting with the technology and improving your meds depends on what's going on in the brain. And Rhoda, we're looking to Rhoda for all the answers there to help us figure out what's going on in the brain, but then also what can we do that's actionable to overcome those barriers. So there's certain themes that throughout the project where we think there's chance for innovation. Ultimately, we hope to have a scalable solution that can be scaled up throughout, get with the guidelines, as well as internationally. So Andrea Beaton, who is really the center director, who brings a lot of international experience in Brazil and elsewhere. So that is a long-term goal of our project as well. And we're going to do that all in the matter of 3 years. But it'll, so anyway, that's like a high level overview.
That's great. Paul, do you want to comment further? That was a remarkable summary.
I could add a little bit, kind of the Stanford side of that is largely at the initial part. Using kind of the design thinking and needs analysis process, some of the initial steps are really to look at the landscape analysis. What's available? What's out there? As Seth's really beautifully described. And then really determine the specifications. What does the solution need to do? What does it have to perform and what ways can it do that. And so really that will lead us to really what we would say is the MVP, the minimal viable product, which will allow it to be tested. So I think those are the, the first, steps that are really important. Some of the key groupings of the need specifications are really along the lines of patient inertia. So the need for patient engagement, which is, really foremost. And then the clinician inertia, very much like what we're dealing with the hypertension model. What are the barriers to clinicians achieving management, guideline-based management? And so I think those are the basics. And as Seth points out, it's really to develop a product that's, ideally be plug and play. So actually in the DOT, it's a digital optimization toolkit. So the idea is there's a little kit, like you have this idea of somebody carrying this little box around, and literally at the time of discharge, they get this box. And so the clinician will get a box, and the patient will, essentially the equivalent of that, digital, that will allow them then to really be able to engage and see these great outcomes in heart failure that we plan for. So that's additional overview points.
Yeah, what I would do is I would add in that, a big theme overall is precision care, precision medicine. And I always like, as Seth sort of intimated, everything we do through our brain. And so we really need to understand during the heart failure journey in recovery, what is your cognitive status? We do know that there is some impact when you have an acute event like this on your brain function. And your care post-heart failure is going to be very dependent on whether you can manage it or not. So what is that care plan? What's the balance between putting the burden of that plan on the participant or the patient versus their caretaker or the ecosystem of caretakers that are working with them? So that's really, I think, the part that we come in is we're really trying to monitor people's changes in cognitive function, and using that to determine what's the precision care plan that would meet what are the capabilities of that individual and their system, their healthcare provider system. And to that end, what we're doing is we're actually doing a landscape project in this first year to figure out what are all the cognitive smartphone applications that are out there, and how can we pick and choose to create a more customized version that would be suitable for this particular purpose, and then also that is most receptive to the people who would have to use it. And so, I always say there's never one application. Well, it turns out there's not one cognitive assessment. And I like to pick and choose and maybe take one piece from that application or one piece from that one and put together a much more, I think, effective protocol, given what the objectives are.
It's interesting. I'm reflecting a little bit on how different this session overall has been from many that I might attend. And really the process of even being involved with this SFRN has been, we typically learn facts about a new disease state when we attend these conferences. We sometimes will hear even some new study design or issues in research that challenges. This one is just different. And I think some of even the nomenclature we've heard today, minimal viable product, design or fit for purpose, the work that we're doing to both identify where the problems are, where the stoppers are, where there's potential solutions. This project, and then the pivoting that has gone on throughout it, has been remarkable. I have learned a lot about just the whole process that Paul referred to from the biodesign work. There's a real science here that's different than the science we typically take in a laboratory. And I think that those who've attended today hopefully will have garnered and gained some in terms of thinking a little differently about how to solve problems in a new and different fashion. Rhoda, sure, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in there that you have to layer on top of the fact that technology changes very rapidly. So, the average life cycle for any technology, I don't care what it is about 6 months to a year. And so when you talk about upending sort of what we traditionally do in research, the fact that we have to be pivoting and changing is a matter of, it's sort of inherently built in to what we're trying to do, creates a much different dynamic.
Paul.
Yeah, I wanted to take both of those great comments as well and reflect on the different challenges for training. So all the SFRNs have a very major component of training the future leaders. And so I think, certainly for this SFRN, I think we all have approached it differently in the sense that there's some specific skills in technology development that we wanted to certainly develop and emphasize in our trainees. So these are things more like project management. So, a typical laboratory, you gain the scientific skills, et cetera, that you need. But in this kind of area, you want to be able to train the trainee in terms of how do you take it from the needs perspective and all the way to product design and then testing. And so it really, we're giving our trainees that role. So each one steps forward and has a part of that puzzle in terms of learning the process of project management. So what does it take? So with the idea that when they leave, they'll be able to say, well, I've identified this new need. My career is going to be in developing new technology in this space. And I feel very comfortable taking it through that kind of area. And that, on the, that includes even, I would say, soft skills, people skills in terms of management, doing interviewing, understanding how to build the team, et cetera, aspects of leadership. And they're also learning, as you said, the terminology, how to start evaluating technology, the interface with the EHR, how you're going to interface with other, sensors, wearables, et cetera. So they're learning that broader spectrum of things that we might each not know in our typical scientific training. So I think that is something that we all look forward in terms of in the important role that the AHA has identified in terms of developing these training centers.
Yeah, we think about typically the life cycle of technology or of life sciences sits on the average of 17 years to go from a bench discovery and sequentially through to ultimately testing and then adoption by patients. And we're looking at more of a 17-month time frame for you guys to have developed de novo from an idea down to something that hopefully will be not only developed but also tested in our patient population. So our hats off. You have certainly met and fully surpassed so far the test. So we're very impressed with what you've been able to do. My final question to each of you to think about is a little bit of, where will we be at the end of this project? You can talk a little bit about what your center individually you think will find, or think a little bit about more broadly, what's the next generation for this effort? I know Patrick and I think a lot about that, but maybe start with you, Seth. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it will be the success in training that Paul's talking about. Part of it will be achieving the goals of our individual projects. And part of it will be the foundation for this to live on. So I think just to start with training, because training is super critical here. I think after the initial phase of this project, I hope we truly will launch the future leaders of health tech and innovation in a diverse group at that. And that's going to be partly because they've had some formal aspects of training, like Nino Isakadze did a master's in our School of Public Health, but she's also getting to work with large technology companies, participating in design sessions, looking at the fonts and the colors of our app and the placement of symbols and understanding the depth of thinking that goes into that, to the design. And ultimately that it's being driven by the patient needs. Really, the first principles, as Rhoda says, the technology will continue to evolve, but the first principles of what our patients' needs are, those may to some extent be timeless first principles, and we need to deeply understand them and then build the solutions to reflect them. And so I hope that we're giving, as you said, Eric, this is very different what we're doing. And I hope that we're really embracing that and really setting our trainees up for success. And our trainees have already developed a beautiful kind of collaboration across centers. Rhoda's team launched a journal club, and the fellows are coming together that way. So I hope that we'll not only have kind of taught them within our centers, but also connected them, and they're going to be lifelong colleagues that are going to be coming and sharing all their amazing achievements in the many years ahead at HA sessions. I think number two, that our centers will achieve our goals. For our particular center, that would mean that David and Ali and our team have a scalable smartphone-based technology to analyze eye movements to make sure that strokes aren't getting missed. And it'll mean that we have a virtual cardiac rehab program built on our Corey platform that we can not only deliver to our patient at Hopkins, but we can deliver at Stanford and BU and all over the country. And we're, in addition to the science of that, we are building the network of stakeholders that are going to be necessary to scaling post-trial. One of those key stakeholders is the AHA, which has really been a great kind of convener of our centers, but also industry. I think an AHA recognizes the need to accelerate things beyond 17 years in terms of translating things to practice. So I think part of it will be those goals, and then having like scalable platforms. But then third is the longevity of this network. I think we've all gotten along very well so far. We have this .hf project launch. That's one that's, we're all learning from each other. I guess for folks that haven't had experience participating in SFRNs, we all come together as total centers every 6 months, but then there's a lot of cross-center meetings in between. So there's a lot of crosstalk between our centers. We're constantly learning from each other. But in addition to that, as we mentioned, we're all working together on one project where we have a shared budget, all with this goal of .hf. So I hope that .hf will achieve its goal of improving medication optimization using our digital toolkit, but that'll be a model for ongoing collaborations of our centers. And in fact, we already have other kind of collaborative grants that we're applying for. So given the shared interest of Michigan, Brahmaji and his team at Michigan, along with myself and colleagues in virtual cardiac rehab, we're collaborating with Alexis Beatty at UCSF. She's been part of the HA Center for Health Tech and Innovation on a large grant to PCORI to further kind of all of our shared models of cardiac rehab. So I hope that if grants like that are funded, but also that business, that sort of these develop commercial success, the technologies that are building commercial success, that'll lead to the ongoing life of this network. So it's not going to end after 4 years. This is going to live on and on. And I think that's like one of the unique goals that the HA, I understand, has had with this network. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think that wraps it up.
Paul?
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to go back to the broad vision you, Eric, and Patrick had in creating this. You indeed did take a pretty big, I think, I would say risk, but, it was a big jump for this. Very different than the other SFRNs, very different than what AHA has done. But I think, as you've heard from my colleagues, this has been an overwhelming success, right? To bring multiple groups together with very, different viewpoints, things that they've done differently, and then come together with a single project was a leap. But I think they will produce a product. They will produce a toolkit that'll be ready for commercialization. And I think, I know that in our hypertension project, we are going to have a commercializable product. It's going to be integrated with EHR, et cetera. I think the next big issue is really, I view it very much like I spoke about the biodesign program. This is like that. It takes the concept to a product, but there's a life after that. That's what we've learned in the biodesign process, is that you really need some other jumping off point. And I think in digital space you do, and that's typically something equivalent to an accelerator. right? So I think very much an outgrowth, an HTI, SFRN 2.0 is like an accelerator. And so I think if there's going to be a life going on, this whole path of the kind of the journey of idea, journey of health digital technology is going from concept all the way, but then to really get commercialization, you need that something extra, that goes beyond this, that typically has people who can really take this from, what we develop, through very thoughtful ways and frequently have tested it in clinical trials, but then get it so it's commercializable and can really live. Who knows what the marketplace is going to be when we finish all these things? What will it look like? Who will buy this? Who will in fact embrace this as a technology so that it can live on? I think our goal here is obviously academic in the sense we want to understand how you can produce technology and how you can train people. But at the end of the day, we want to help patients pretty directly. And so the technology has to live on. And so we really want to see that. So thanks.
Rhoda?
So I'll just very quickly, because I know we're over time. So I think sort of big picture. In terms of the next generation, I think we're teaching leaders that understand the words value proposition, return on investment, market penetration. And those are really going to be very important to taking things out of the lab and put it out in the real world. I think the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually understand what are truly digital biomarkers. I think the current way in which we're doing it is very limited. And I think that the efforts that are going to come out of this initiative will help push that field forward in a way that many probably can't imagine right now. And then the third thing and final thing is I think this is a test bed for global. We're all about inclusivity. And I think that this is not just a model for within us or within the HA or within the US. I think that we're really trying to think about how does this work at a truly worldwide level. And so that's sort of at least certainly my hope.
And then Patrick, you may want to comment a little bit on Paul's comment on what is the jumping off and accelerator part of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this was, everyone added really elegant moments here and thoughts. This was brilliant. We couldn't have articulated the outputs and the rationale for this particular SFRN any better. But I wholeheartedly agree that one of the key elements of this will really be, is this a springboard to commercialization efforts, and are there things that we can do that come right out of the research that flow in the industry? And just as importantly, can we add to the lexicon of digital health outcomes research and actually teach and show the marketplace to a certain extent how to do this and what evidence really means versus white papers and marketing materials? How should you really get to market? And so it's this clever little intersection we're going for. And I think, as several of you noted, this idea that can this network also stay together, and should it, to do things individually and jointly over time as a bit of an engine. And as you note, Eric, perhaps to a certain extent, and in a new way, a bit of an accelerator. So I think for all the reasons mentioned and what I shared, those are the novelties of what we've done with this particular network. And its purpose is clear. It's moving fast, and we're very excited. I'll only note, and there's been several messages in the chat, that this is not the only one, even though that we think this is the most important. The SFRNs are ongoing, and they're typically several a year. We have about 13 or 14, I believe, now. And the latest one that's coming up very quickly, and there's a connection to it in the chat, is focused on diversity in clinical trials and looking at those underlying issues. We've all kind of commented on that, and this has been a strong thematic throughout this year's sessions, and trying to think about what are the proper solutions to address diversity in clinical trials. And so I just give that as a little bit of a plug for other things coming. And even though this is by far the most important one that we have, there's just no question about it.
So, thank you, Patrick. I think in closing, I'm reflective of my own career early on, we were part of one of the first SFRNs that was devoted to outcomes research. And that term isn't even used much anymore, but a generation of people were launched through that SFRM that still permeates the field, and I think have made certain impacts which are important and interesting to see. We always thought of ourselves as being the most collaborative of any of the SFRNs. Everybody is convinced that they did the best and set the bar the highest. But I truly have to admit, we were far surpassed by this group you're witnessing today. You guys have worked together more seamlessly and with more success so far than even we had years back. I do have to thank the Heart Association one more time for being so innovative in their processes of putting together these networks and their work in experimenting and exploring new ways in which we can do science and ultimately impact on our patients. And then finally, I want to thank each of our panelists, Paul, Rhoda, Seth, and Patrick, who have done an amazing job, unrehearsed, I will tell you, and in live format, something rarer and rarer these days. But have done a great job of explaining what each of their groups are doing, what we'll be doing together, and ultimately how we're hoping to transform the field. So thank you very much to everybody who's attended this session, and hope you enjoy the rest of the Heart Association meetings. Thanks.
Thanks all. Thanks,
Thank you
Eric.
so
Great
much.
job.
Thank you.